Moving right along. The deep roots of revolution. So, as we know, we left off with the Proclamation of 1763, which was one of the early causes of the revolution that barred settlers from settling west of what mountain range? Appalachia, very good. And did they follow the proclamation?
No.
They did not. They kept on moving west. And this angered the British. But obviously the Brits don't want to have to continue to pay for Native American conflict beyond Appalachia, but they also have a massive debt that they've got to pay off. And that's the direction we're heading in today, because we're going to be talking about taxation. So let's talk a little bit about the deep roots of revolution. In a broad sense, and I feel like I'm ripping off Henry Louis Gates today, Skip Gates, professor at Harvard. Has anyone ever seen the PBS series, the Ancestry series on PBS, where they like interview celebrities and that's him. He does that show. So I'm kind of ripping him off here. In a broad sense, the revolution begins when the first settlers arrive at Jamestown and at Plymouth, because what do those settlers ultimately create in those colonies? Representative what? Government, right? They are creating their own representative government 3,000 miles away from the crown. So we've got to think about that, right? Democratic principles are taking root in the American colonies from the get-go. And as we've already learned, all of these colonies have charters, all of these colonies have representative governments, and most of these colonies have a formation of like a two-house legislature. Americans felt physically and spiritually separated from England. I mean, let's think about the spiritual side of this. We've also learned a whole lot of people came here for religious freedom. A lot of people came here for economic opportunity. A lot of people came here for the opportunity to own land. So there are a variety of reasons that people roll the dice to come to the New World. Hello, thank you, appreciate it. Colonists felt that they were more independent. Remember, in the more recent sense, we talked about the Great Awakening and how that was a universal sort of spiritual moment that kind of united a lot of the colonists. We see the rise of new religious denominations, or at least Christian denominations. Many colonists began to think of themselves as Americans because most were separated by generations from the crown. Okay? Some of them separated as far as 5 generations. So they developed a different style of culture. You'd be surprised how fast they lost their British accents and developed American accents. In fact, has anyone ever heard of Tangiers Island up in Virginia? It's off the coast of Virginia. If you're ever wondering what a British colonial American sounded like, their dialect is as close as we have, because they're isolated, to what the British American colonists sounded like. Colonists became more enraged by the mercantile system. Obviously, we talked about mercantilism or mercantilism and the fact that all of their goods needed to go to the mother country. As you mentioned before, smuggling continues to ramp up. They also have a hatred for that 1733 Molasses Act. That was the first tax levied on sugar and molasses. But remember, that act was actually more aimed at France as opposed to the colonists. Colonists were restricted in what they could manufacture. They could not mass produce woolen cloth. They could not mass produce beaver pelt hats, because that would lead to competition with the mother country. Again, that goes back to mercantilism or mercantilism. Colonists didn't really have a common currency. For a time, colonists did produce their own printed money, but that printed money was in short supply, and it also depreciated quickly. So it kind of depended on what colony the currency was coming from. Like if you were to look at and I'll show you this later in a different lesson. If you were to look at a Virginia $4 bill, okay, probably never heard that in your life before. That Virginia $4 bill was actually backed by foreign currency. So they didn't even have the means. They had very little supply of gold or silver to back their own currency. And then at the end of the French and Indian War in 1764, Britain passed the Currency Act that barred the colonists from producing their own currency. Colonial laws, as we've talked about before, could be voided or overruled by the Privy Council. The Privy Council, now I think this is pretty interesting. We remember the Privy Council, right? They're a group of advisors in Parliament that oversee colonial law. They're kind of like a check and balance to colonial law. Well, only 469 colonial laws out of 8,563 were overruled or rejected by the Privy Council. And also in that 469, any law attempting to abolish slavery was rejected. Now, if you're looking at this in terms of a percentage, most colonial laws passed on through without issue. But even though it was just 469, this angered and bothered the colonists, especially colonial lawmakers. So on the left, we have most of your mercantile goods coming out of the colonies: tobacco, rice, wheat, hides, fish, corn, indigo, rum, lumber, shipbuilding. And by shipbuilding, we're talking about not only the construction of ships, but also that ties to the timber industry, and also naval stores. For example, what product would the colonies produce in all over, but predominantly in on the coast, would the colonies produce for the crown? They required hemp. Ooh, you're close. Rope. A lot of rope production in the colonies. And then we have a handy dandy graphic organizer just to kind of lay out how mercantilism had an impact here, right? British-French rivalry that led to the French and Indian War, Spanish colonial system that led to conflict and naval wars with Spain, mid-18th century wars, War of Jenkins' Ear, French and Indian, War of Wall Street Succession, our King George's Wars, Queen Anne's Wars, which were another series of naval wars, American War for Independence, and of course African slave trade and African American slaves. So, Sugar Act and Quartering Act uproar. After the French and Indian War, Britain had a huge war debt. It was massive. It's estimated that the war debt was over 122 million pounds, sterling silver, British currency. Parliament had no intention of making America pay for it all, because what do we know about this war? It was what? Global, right? It was happening in Europe and it was happening in America. However, they couldn't afford to pay for it all. They felt like the colonists had to be on the hook for some of the cost, especially since a lot of British redcoats were still in the colonies, had served in Pontiac's War, and were guarding the Proclamation line, and were still stationed in colonial ports. Clearly, the colonists were not happy about their presence. Overwhelmingly, from top to bottom, from New England down to the southern colonies, the presence of British soldiers was not welcome. So, King George III and Prime Minister, do you guys know what the job of the Prime Minister is in England? That person is the head of what? Parliament. Very good. Head of Parliament. Nice job. The Prime Minister was George Grenville. They ordered that the navigation laws be strictly enforced, which means no more what? Smuggling. Very good. Nice job. No more smuggling. And they also are going to pass the Sugar Act of 1764. This is the first tax passed after the French and Indian War. What this tax will do, it'll be a tax levied on sugar imported from the West Indies. Interestingly enough, this tax was actually less than the Molasses Act tax. However, this tax was more offensive because in most cases, the Molasses Act tax was not all that heavily enforced. This tax was enforced. And remember, this upsets people because you need a lot of sugar to make what? Alcohol, right? So this upsets your everyday colonist that produces corn liquor or rye whiskey or rum or beer or wine or whatever, okay? So protests from the colonists ultimately led to these taxes being reduced, and then later the Sugar Act will be repealed or removed. Next year, 1765, Parliament will pass the Quartering Act. I do want you to realize that the Quartering Act, even though it had not been made law, the system of quartering had already been put into place. And I also want you to understand that the Quartering Act at this period of time isn't nearly as, it's not utilized on the level that you might think, because most of the British soldiers in this period of peace, post French and Indian War, post Pontiac's War to the Revolution, they're like taking up like storage facilities in commercial centers and turning them into barracks, or they are moving in on colonial farms and setting up encampments, or it's not like every colonial home has a British soldier living in it. I want to be really clear on this. But this was offensive enough that the colonists began to protest, especially colonists in the colonial commercial centers. Colonists in places like Boston and New York were very upset about the Quartering Act, so much so that in 1767, New York's legislature was suspended for failure to comply with the Quartering Act. Where we really see the Quartering Act ramp up is when the law is reissued in 1774, heading into the Revolution, and even during the Revolution, where the Brits are able to like just come in and be like, hey, I'm moving into your home. Another part of this too, guys, is that it's not only about the Brits moving into homes or onto private property, the colonists are also on the hook for feeding them. So that creates problems and tension, because what do the colonists not have a lot of? They don't have a lot of cash. Their commodity is food. And if they're giving up their food, then that's less that's coming to their table. Feels kind of Hunger Games-ish, right? A little bit. Yeah? All right. So, we have George III on the left and Prime Minister George Grenville on the right. So let's talk a little bit about the Stamp Act uproar. So in 1765, Parliament imposed a stamp tax. This is called the Stamp Act of 1765 to raise money for the war debt and the large military force that is in the colonies at this period of time. This is sort of like passed on the heels of the repeal of the Sugar Act. Because they're like, all right, well, if we're not going to tax sugar, let's tax printed items. So the Stamp Act taxed all printed items and mandated the use of an affixed stamp to certify payment of the tax. Interestingly enough, there were people that actually thought this would be a decent idea. One of them was Ben Franklin at first. Ben Franklin was like, this isn't the worst idea. This can only offend so many people. But he realized that not too long after it was passed, that this was going to create a problem because guess what? Stamps were required on bills of sale for about 50 trade items. So I'm talking about marriage licenses, birth certificates, deeds to property, playing cards, dice, you name it. If it was printed, it was taxed. And you're going to really upset a very powerful group. You're upsetting lawyers and the press, right? And that's not a group that you necessarily want to tangle with, because why are these people not the group you necessarily want to get all fired up? Yeah. Both can be persuasive and yeah, they both can be persuasive, and they both have a large mouthpiece and a large audience, right? So you've angered the wrong group. So both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act provided for offenders to be tried in what were called admiralty courts. Admiralty courts seem like not a big deal to us, but they were tremendously offensive to the colonists, because what did the colonists in their own courts use that we still use today to determine a jury? And in the admiralty court, it was like you were guilty until proven innocent, because there was no jury and there was no colonial jury. It was a sentence handed down by a judge. So the admiralty courts actually don't really go anywhere. They don't, even though these two guys, I want to be crystal clear, both the Stamp Act and the Sugar Act ultimately are repealed, but the admiralty court issue sticks around. That's a real big reason why John Adams represented the soldiers following the Boston Massacre. We're not going to get that far today, but he wanted to prove that the colonists were going to put their money where their mouth was and not only provide fair representation, but also provide a trial by jury. George III and Grenville felt that the taxes were fair, and they were just simply asking the colonies to pay their fair share. And what's also wild is that the British citizens were paying a much heavier debt for the war than the colonists were. And now the British are like, wait a minute, British citizens are like, why are we paying all this money for a war that was fought 3,000 miles away? So if you look at this objectively, you can see both sides of the common person's anger about having to pay these high taxes to pay for this war. Americans felt that they were unfairly taxed for an unnecessary army. Hadn't they fought and defeated the French in Pontiac and Pontiac's warriors? And hadn't they defeated them? So colonists are going to lash out. Here come the protests. So these are the stamps that were used for the Stamp Act. And over there on the right is a protest poster from Williamsburg, the Williamsburg Gazette. This is the place to affix the stamp. And that piece of propaganda started to be spread all over the colonies. All right, so no taxation without representation. We all heard this before. Where does it come from? Today you will find out. So Americans formed this battle cry, no taxation without representation, thanks to Massachusetts lawyer James Otis. And I know you have done the Freedom Trail, right? Has anyone else done the Freedom Trail? Hey, you've done it? That's one of the first graves that you pass on the Freedom Trail is the grave of James Otis from Boston. He was a Harvard-educated lawyer. He was also the brother of Mercy Otis Warren. I don't know if you're familiar with her. She was a very famous author during the American Revolution. She's considered a founding mother. Mercy Otis Warren, we'll talk a bit about her when we get into lesson 6, because I've got a little piece that I like to share about our founding mothers. They kind of get forgotten about during the Revolution, and I like to give them some love. So, Americans were under the principle of being taxed by England. Colonies did not, as you pointed out earlier, guys, they did not have representation in Parliament. But here is an important takeaway. Do they really want representation in Parliament? No. Why do they need representation 3,000 miles away? Think about it. How long is it going to take you to get your representative back to England? Months. And then when they get there, who are they representing? All 13 colonies? Or are you sending 13 representatives? By the time they leave and they go there and they get back, it might be a year, right? This was a perfect angle. This was a political move. No taxation without representation. And you know what, guys? George Grenville took the bait and said, this is absurd. You are virtually represented by the crown because we have given you, well, not all, but most of the colonies had been provided with colonial governors directly by the crown. And that was it. Because Grenville institutes this virtual representation theory, the colonies can run with it. There's also another moment that is really important in relation to this. And it was kind of a silly move. Ben Franklin was in England in the midst of all this, and Parliament put Ben Franklin on trial. Did you all ever know that? And when he was put on trial, they're like throwing all these accusations at Ben Franklin. And Ben Franklin may have been the first person to say this abroad. We don't know, but probably was. I am not British. I am an American. And like, what were you going to do to Ben Franklin? Try Ben Franklin for treason and execute him? That would have like sparked a war immediately. I mean, the guy's an international rock star. He's beloved. So that's another misstep by the crown when they put Franklin on trial. I'll talk more about that as we move forward. So Americans reject the virtual representation laid out by Grenville in Parliament. Here on the left, we have James Otis, and on the right, we have Mercy Otis Warren. And this is where we pump the brakes today. This is all I've got for you today. In October of 1765, representatives from 9 of the 13 colonies met in New York, and they discussed the Stamp Act. This becomes known as the Stamp Act Congress. The only colonies that didn't send representation, Virginia, Georgia, North Carolina, and New Hampshire. Virginia had their own Stamp Act Congress that was actually led by Patrick Henry. All right? So, this Stamp Act Congress was one of the early intercolonial gatherings with representation. It sort of hearkened to the Albany Congress that was held in the French and Indian War. Did anything come out of this Kind of. Yes and no. One thing that came out of this that seems sort of trivial is the Declaration of Rights and Grievances, where they send this to England and say, here are all of our problems. We would like these addressed. Absolutely no one in the Declaration of Rights and Grievances is asking for what? I'm looking for another word. They are looking for that. No one is asking for independence. Yeah, no one's asking for independence here. However, what makes this important is that it's completely ignored by the Crown. Had the Crown addressed it and been willing to negotiate, the revolution may have been delayed. I don't think it's fair to say the revolution would have never happened. I think it was an inevitability. All right? So that was ignored. However, what does come out of this is the ultimate repeal of the Stamp Act. It does not last very long. It's just about, I think it's lasts for about 4 months. Okay? Because they've upset so many of the wrong people. Colonists start to boycott supplies. They start making their own stuff. Okay? This also leads to the rise of the Sons and Daughters of Liberty. Now, I know in our heart of hearts, we want to associate the Sons of Liberty with Boston always. But they're everywhere. Same with the Daughters of Liberty. I mean, every different colony had these groups, Sons and Daughters of Liberty, that had either boycotts or protests, some of which became destructive, some of which became violent, some of which were totally nonviolent, and they were all over the place. So, demands appeared in Parliament for the repeal of the Stamp Act. Many in Parliament wanted to know why 7.5 million Brits had to pay heavy taxes to protect just over 2 million people in colonial America. Now we've got division brewing in England. People are like, as early as this era, in the pre-revolutionary period, as early as this, there are people in England saying, why are we still dealing with this? Why are we continuing to do this? Let them become a province. Nobody's saying let them be independent. They're not going that far. But give them their autonomy. This is going to ultimately create fracture in Parliament as well as we move into the Revolution. So in 1766, Parliament repealed or got rid of the Stamp Act, but passed what was called the Declaratory Act, proclaiming that Parliament had the right to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. Here come another round of taxes, and this is the round of taxes that are going to lead to violence and the destruction of private property. Because the direction we're heading in is the Townshend Act and ultimately the Tea Act. Okay? So that's all I've got today, but I do want to leave you with this awesome political cartoon, the Repeal Stamp Act political cartoon. It shows this funeral procession for the Stamp Act. And if you're wondering why the Stamp Act is in a baby coffin, it only lasted 4 months. The head parishioner has a dog peeing on his leg. There's a lot going on in this cartoon. This is going to be a real, this is going to be a boom time for political cartoons, the American Revolution. All right, questions for me? Comments, concerns? All right, cool. So, what we are going to do now, I've got a